If you're over 40 and nothing in your life feels exciting anymore, not your hobbies, not your day to day, not even the things that you used to look forward to, but everything still looks fine on the outside, that's a problem because that's exactly where I was. And I didn't just hear people talking about it, I was living it. And the key word there was. I used to have things that I was into, and I don't mean casually. I mean really into them. I raced dirt bikes and I built them for myself and for others. That was a side business. I had street bikes and hot rods and 4x4s, boats and jets, jet skis, sorry, and ATVs. Boy, I wish I had jets. Imagine having that status. I had every tool known to man. And I could fix or modify any of those things. And I enjoyed that, you know, just as much as having those things. You know, truth is, maybe more than even driving them. Just time in the garage, just working on these things, just the peace that brought. And if I wasn't doing those things, or maybe sometimes even combining them, I was outdoors. Camping, hunting, fishing, kayaking. You know, that was all me. And somewhere along the way, that guy disappeared. And not all at once, just slowly. Until, one day I wasn't doing any of it anymore. And instead, find myself sitting there watching it on YouTube. Watching younger guys live the life that I used to live, thinking, man, I need to get off my ass and get back into some of this. Because back then I was actually living. There's a difference between being alive and living. And I've realized, I still have time left. We're all born dying. That's the truth. None of us are getting out alive. And I just don't want to waste, what's left of my time. But, you know, back then I wasn't doing anything about it. I was just sitting there, and that's as far as it went. And I knew that wasn't me. I'm not a spectator, I'm a contender. Wounds heal, scars fade, but glory lives on forever. That's the guy I always was. So, how does someone like that just stop? I told myself the same thing everyone else does, the same lies that everyone else does. This is just getting older. You know, well, if that's true, then why are there 80-year-old men chasing golf balls around on a golf course? So, know, or maybe it's just everything I've been through. And with that said, if you've been here on my channel before, you already know what I mean by that. But the problem was, I didn't know what to do about it. But that's not where this stays, because I figured something out. And I'm not just talking about it, I'm actually doing it. And I'm going to show you with, um, no motivational speeches, not theories, real action. Excuse me for clearing my throat. The pollen is killing me here in South Georgia right now. Real action, like I said, even when I don't feel like it. Because nothing was technically wrong. I was still functioning. I was handling life, showing up, but something was missing. Not gone, just fading, and more every day. The things I used to love just didn't hit the same. I'd try, and 10 minutes later, I was done. No feeling, no pull, nothing. And that's a really weird place to be when you think about it, because nothing's technically broken, but nothing feels right either. So you explain it away. This is just life now. And the more you say that, the more you believe that, until it becomes true. But then it hit me. This wasn't coming and going. It stayed. So I had to actually look at it. And I started thinking, you know, maybe it was the relationship. Maybe being with a narcissist for that long changed something in me. Because, if you've been through that, you know exactly what it does. It wears you down, it disconnects you until, you don't even recognize yourself anymore. But, and yeah, it changed me. But it doesn't get to keep me. At some point, that stops being the reason, and it becomes the excuse. And that's on me. So now it's on me, just to get back out there, to stop saying no and start saying yes again. Even if it's uncomfortable, even if something's completely new. Because the truth is, it wasn't just what I went through, it was this too. The things I've always said I would do, but never actually did. You know how it goes. Life gets busy, responsibilities, kids, money, time, all the normal reasons, that why we don't do the things that we've planned on doing. The life gets in the way stuff. And I think that's where the term, bucket list comes from. And mine's pretty big. But, you know, if I'm being honest, those were excuses. And those excuses are exactly what got me here. So this is where it changes. Not by going backwards, but by doing things I never did. Like right now I'm thinking, something as simple as going on a cruise. I've never done it. Always wanted to, never did. Always had an excuse why I couldn't. The ones I've just mentioned: kids, money, time. I'll get to it later. You know, and also, for a long time, being alone now would have been my reason not to. There's a whole nother reason now, right? But not anymore. If I want to do something, I'm doing it. Alone or not, because waiting, for the right time or the right person, that's how you lose years. That's how we've already lost years. And I'm done losing them. And I'm going to document it. I'm stepping out of my comfort zone, and I'm going to step way out of it. Doing things I've never done before. I'm going to get back into life again. So, you're not just hearing this. You're going to see it. Because knowing and doing are two different things. And most people never cross that line. And I almost didn't either. But that's where it starts. So if you're feeling this, you're not the only one, because I'm right there with you. And I'm not staying here. I'm getting back into life. And I'm taking you with me. We're going to start doing things again. You know, that's what makes you feel something again. So if you're here right now, stay with me, because this isn't just a video. This is a start. And we're not doing it alone. That's a fact.